All right, well, welcome all. Welcome to this afternoon's panel on From Data Sovereignty to Data Science, Implications for American Indian Self-Determination. My name is Dr. Leah Shanley, and I'm here from the Nelson Institute, the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Well, welcome all. Welcome to this afternoon's panel on From Data Sovereignty to Data Science, Implications for American Indian Self-Determination. Okay, so let's begin. So I've worked for 4 years with four American Indian tribes over the past couple decades, including helping to build tribal capacity for geospatial technologies. Okay, so let's begin. So I've worked for 4 years with four American Indian tribes over the past Okay, so let's start with a land acknowledgement. As we are meeting virtually from places across the country, we'd like to respectfully acknowledge all tribes. And I think I know what the problem is here. Okay, so let's start with a land acknowledgement. Okay, I think I've got this figured out. Yes, thank you. We had Attendify on and several different computers, so we're getting echoes. So as we're meeting virtually from places across the country, we would like to respectfully acknowledge all tribes and their members in the United States. Wherever you are on Indian land. They did not invite us to come here, nor to build another civilization on top of theirs. They endured centuries of genocide and attempted erasure, but they are resilient and still endure. We encourage you to reflect on the land where you are now privileged to sit and how you can support this vibrant Indigenous community who continue to thrive in your area. If you want to be an advocate or an ally, please start by acknowledging that the power inequities exist in our academic disciplines, including data science, and support the power of Indigenous communities to mobilize their own data sovereignties. So before we begin, I'm going to cover some basics, and I'm going to share screen. Okay. There we go. So there are 474 federally recognized tribes within the US and many more state recognized tribes. American Indian tribes, however, are not another ethnic or special interest group. Rather, as legal scholar Rebecca Tsosie asserts, tribal governments pre-existed before the United States and are not part of the constitutional compact that governs the federal government and the states. Tribes are distinct, independent political communities. This political relationship is based on treaties and other legal agreements, federal Indian law, and international human rights law. In order to discuss Indigenous data sovereignty, we must first briefly review a couple of core concepts. Tribes are sovereign nations with inherent powers of self-government over their reservations and over their trust lands. That means tribal governments have their own laws and regulations, And like state governments, they can enact statutes that govern data access by implementing tribal open records and privacy laws. Second, tribes have unique government-to-government relationship with the federal government. A set of Supreme Court cases from the early 1800s, known as the Marshall Trilogy, form the foundation of what's known as the federal trust tribal relationship. It establishes a fiduciary duty and moral obligation on the part of the federal government to protect tribal lands, assets, resources, treaty rights, and I would argue, tribal data. Another powerful legal concept is the doctrine of reserved rights. The Supreme Court has stated that as an Indian treaty does not a grant of rights to Indians, but is a grant of rights from tribal governments. So it's a reservation of those rights not granted. So I would argue that like states, tribal governments have reserved rights to control access to their data. Tribal governments, as well as tribal grassroots groups, tribal colleges, tribal corporations, and others, create, maintain, and disseminate data and satellite imagery as part of their day-to-day government and business activities. In addition, the Bureau of Indian Affairs under the Department of Interior administers and manages more than 55 million acres of surface land and 57 million acres of subsurface estates. So they collect data in order to manage those lands on behalf of American Indian tribes and Alaskan Natives. Through the government-to-government relationship, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and other executive agencies have a trust responsibility towards tribes to protect these resources, as well as a duty to consult with tribal governments regarding proposed federal actions and policies that may have tribal impact. These agencies create, maintain, and disseminate information, data, satellite imagery, spatial data as part of their consultation process. And lastly, as we know, university researchers, contractors, nonprofits, and the media also create and use data about tribes and reservations. So based on America's history of colonization, systemic racism, and marginalization, American Indian tribes have had a long-standing concern about the ownership, control, and access to information and data about their lands and resources, communities, and citizens. While misuse of this data has been a long-standing concern, federal and state court cases, as well as the development of advanced technologies like GIS, remote sensing, and machine learning, big data, have brought these concerns to the forefront. At tribal meetings and conferences, I've often heard the concern about helicopter researchers coming into the reservation to take tribal data and knowledge without giving back anything in return. So tribes are concerned for a range of reasons. Through the Freedom of Information Act, third parties have demanded that government agencies and federally funded university researchers hand over tribal data despite confidentiality agreements. This has resulted in the reduced bargaining power of tribes when negotiating leases with companies for tribal timber, rangeland, oil and gas land, minerals, resulting in decreased economic returns. This has affected tribes' ability to assert their sovereign authority, including enforcing air and water quality regulations within the boundaries of their reservations and territories. This has weakened tribes' defense of their water rights and hunting and fishing treaty rights, and has resulted in the infringement of tribal collective sense of privacy, including an unwanted intrusion into tribal sacred ceremonies, destruction of sacred sites, and theft of cultural artifacts. Fundamental issues are at stake here, including tribes' rights and interests in their knowledge, data, land, and resources, federal agencies' authority and decision-making that affect those resources, and the public's right to know. So that brings us to the concept of Indigenous Data Sovereignty, which Rain et al. Define as the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of data concerning a tribe or its members. And a related concept, including Indigenous Data Governance, which is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to control the use or reuse of tribal data by third parties, including data collected for earlier research studies. So what can we do? Well, we'll need to balance data protection with tribal government transparency and access to data by tribal citizens. We'll also need to build internal capacity and data science skills to use these technologies to a tribe's advantage. So I'd like to introduce 4 outstanding distinguished speakers who will explore these topics in their presentations, including James Rattling, Joseph Robertson, Krystal Tsosie, and Randall Akee. We will save the questions for after the presentations. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to James. Let's see, stop sharing.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Leah, again, and welcome to the panel again. As Leah mentioned, my name is James Rattling, and in our traditional ways, we like to introduce ourselves in our own Indigenous language. So I'll do that with you here today as well. Haumidakiapi, Chante Wastenape Zapalo, James Rattling, Imachiapi Nashi Changalakoto Oyate. Good to be with you today. And in my time today, I really want to look at the role of data science and Indigenous people, in particular, education. So I'm a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. I work with Central Climate Adaptation Center, University of Colorado Boulder, and also the Geo Alliance. And all that, in all the associations, affiliations, I think it's important as we think about, as Leah mentioned, the idea of building capacity with tribal governments, tribal nations. I think it's important that we look at that, we consider that, and we begin to think deeply about how we can do that. So I want to share some things that I've been a part of here. I come from the tribal college system. There's 35 tribal colleges across the country of USA. And we've been involved in this idea of Earth observation, data, and science for many years. And so what you see on the screen here is some examples of work we've been doing. We've developed partnerships through what I call new treaty making, developing MOUs and agreements to really foster greater participation in federal programs around Earth observation data. We've developed software programs like ResMapper, again, for us as Lakota people to articulate what Earth observation means in our languages. And so you'll see here some languages here on the screen here about how we understand the role of technology and how that better support needs. And work with elders. And here is a white hat. He's been a great supporter in how we think about data, how we think about science, and also from a tribal college perspective. So in that, I got to expand my work with the University of Colorado Boulder. So we started a new Tribal Climate Leaders program, a fully funded cohort program, a 2-year master's program at the University of Colorado Boulder, focusing on tribal data and tribal science, also with traditional knowledge. The picture here are 5 students that we recruited. They started this fall for the first time. Also part of that effort is to work with tribal college students now. And so what you see here is COVID-19 data infrastructure. It's a data bootcamp project funded by the National Science Foundation at the University of Colorado Boulder, working with 2 tribal colleges there. Again, the idea is to link students with mentors, with the science, with the data and training, and to address real issues dealing with tribal communities. So they looked at flooding. And they also looked at the COVID dashboards and really mapping communities in terms of elders and understanding really the location and opportunities and vulnerability of their elders. So that's an ongoing project. I also want to say that I think it's important for us as Indigenous people to think global. So I've been part of a new effort here called the Geo Indigenous Alliance, gathering now for a year, just trying to understand how Indigenous people work with data, understand and practice tribal data sovereignty, but also think about how we can learn from one another when it comes to implementing traditional knowledge. In particular, we have something called the Geo Indigenous Hackathon. Again, that's targeting youth in Indigenous communities around the world, connecting them with mentors, using what they have in the community in terms of technology and infrastructure, again, to address real issues. And finally, I'll say that we're getting ready now for the Indigenous Symposium scheduled for the first week in December 2020. You're invited. We'll send out a note, information about it. But again, we're bringing together Indigenous practitioners around the world, talking about the work, and also really trying to strengthen our Indigenous Alliance in terms of participation, but also development leadership around this area so that we can build and support our communities. So these are the questions I think that I wanted to share with you all is how can data facilitate tribal nation building? We're trying to rebuild our communities. Again, how can tribes influence better data collection? what are opportunities and challenges that we need to do and consider in terms of data building, and this important topic called data governance. I think it's important that we share our best practices with one another, which is a community of practice, again, of Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Indigenous Data Governance. And what's happening in Indian country, that's a general term we use to describe all of us collectively. How can we do that in a more effective way? Is the Academic Data Science Alliance, is that a platform that we need to consider and we need to look at for future initiatives? Or is this a platform that we can continue to build upon to really, again, address the needs we have in Indian country around data? Finally, I would say, the work I do is I try to communicate between the science and the community. And I think what I think about is when tribal nations collect data, we are telling our story in our own way. Those of us that are promoters of data science, we are information gatherers, information keepers. Again, because we are tribal, we think about both the past, the present, and the future. So the term ancestors, I'm not sure if that term ever came up in Academic Data Science Alliance, but we use it and we believe in it. So just as our ancestors, we look at essential information to tell the stories. And then these new stories are being told to sustain our people and forge our future. So with that, that's my time. Thank you for listening. Back to you, Leah.
Wonderful. Thank you, James. That was outstanding. Up next, I'd like to introduce Joseph Robertson.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Joseph Robertson. I'm the founder and chief data scientist of Mato Ohitika Analytics, LLC. I want to thank the Academic Data Science Alliance and Dr. Shanley and James Rattling for the invitation to be on this panel today. The title of my talk is The Impact of Data Sovereignty on American Indian Self-Determination, Using Data Science and Developing Grassroots Strategies for Tribal Community Development. Today, I want to just outline a few things that I want to talk about. This is a quick fire, so it's going to go quick. I'll just talk about me at a glance, something a little bit about land acknowledgement, honoring our past and looking at the origins of data science, and then looking at data sovereignty, the data sovereignty framework, and the data sovereignty initiative that I've created through my company. And then I just wanted to introduce some scientific work in education with my new foundation that I've started. So I'm an enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the Lake Traverse Reservation in Northeast South Dakota. I'm currently working on machine learning and artificial intelligence research and development in creating smart solutions for tribal communities. I currently hold a PhD in computational statistics and a Master of Statistics from South Dakota State University. I also hold a highly qualified teaching certificate in mathematics where I taught in the Indian education system for a number of years. And I hold a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics. Dr. Shanley showed this as part of the land acknowledgement. I think it's a way for us to just remember that in the pre-colonial American Indian land base was about 3.5 million square miles. And today, through treaties and through Manifest Destiny, we've got about 87,000 square miles left, about the size of Idaho. And so it's always a good reminder to know that that this is indigenous people's homelands that we're on here in the United States. I also wanted to just show where I live, and up in the upper left, of course, is the American Indian reservations as they are now. And down in the left corner here, we've got the 9 Indian reservations in South Dakota. And my reservation is the Lake Traverse Reservation up here. And this is a picture of the Lake Traverse Reservation where my people call home the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate. And historically, Native Americans that comprised the Great Sioux Nation consisted of 3 divisions of the Oceti Sakowin, 7 council fires, which include the Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota people. I wanted to just briefly mention about Professor Hayashi. Chikio Hayashi is essentially the pioneer and founder of data science. And so he introduced the term in a roundtable discussion in 1996 at the International Federation of Classification Societies. And here there was the first term that data science was included in the title of the conference, Data Science Classification and Related Methods. He went on to write a paper, What is Data Science, which is the fundamental concepts, and provided a heuristic proof of concept was very powerful in doing the studies that I had. Professor Hayashi had a couple of things. Data science, he said, was intended to analyze and understand actual phenomena with data. And more deeply, the aim of data science is to reveal features or the hidden structure of complicated natural, human, and social phenomena with data from a different point of view, from established or traditional theory and method. And this point of view implies multidimensional, dynamic, and flexible way of thinking. The DSI framework is designed from my doctoral work, The Impact of Data Sovereignty on American Indian Self-Determination, a proof of concept using data science. And this is a collection of methods and concepts that is a way to responsibly bridge science and culture. The DSI framework, it consists of many interdisciplinary ideas such as higher education, citizen science, data science, governance, and analytics, and really drives two primary ideas. Number one, data sovereignty is the act of democratization of data for the community's benefit, and establishing solid data ethics principles are fundamental to providing communities with intelligence that works for them. There was a series of discussions in 2015 in Australia about data sovereignty, and here's in those essays, they define data sovereignty as the means of managing information in a way that is consistent with the laws and practices and customs of the nation state in which it's located. Here are some of the blueprints of the data sovereignty initiative that I created. Here we have mutually exclusive cultural, scientific, and interdisciplinary key indicators. And then we pair those with key descriptors to create this custom-built data domain to drive interdisciplinary analysis and strategic assessment. And essentially what we're doing is we're trying to do a careful interlocking of these disciplines to form a smart solution by integrating cultural, scientific, and interdisciplinary methods of design and consultation. So that's essentially what my doctoral work was heading towards. Just in the last couple minutes, I'd just like to present some of the bridging data science and grassroots community development, some of the work that my company currently does. So I'd like to cover 4 or 5 kind of things that are happening in the data science space for me and my company. First is the cultural bioregion project of the Honktawan or the Yankton Nation, the Mini Wizipan Wakan project, or the Sacred Water Bundle project. I've been working with the Braveheart Society and on the Yankton Reservation to empower tribal governments and grassroots Native communities of the Missouri River to restore traditional Native practices of water and land management. And this project is guided by the dreams of the elders of the White Swan Oyankee of the community. And we're looking to produce an atlas and a database of the hydroscape and the indigenous cultural sites of the Missouri River Basin to create a baseline aimed at the ability to apply integrated indigenous knowledge in water policy. Another project that I've been working on is the Zuya Winya Wichayu Oniha project, which is honoring warrior women. It was a cultural risk assessment for harm reduction to Native women and families in the corridor adjacent to the Keystone XL pipeline, the proposed pipeline, and to prevent any further murdered and missing Indigenous women. In January, I testified as a lay witness on behalf of the Yankton Sioux tribe to the public interest and beneficial use of water in regard to TransCanada's water permits that would provide water to the man camps in the South Dakota corridor of the Keystone XL pipeline. So essentially the risk assessment was to provide evidence of the lack of police capacity near the Yankton and Rosebud reservations to handle the sudden influx of men coming into these camps. As you can see, it's about an hour's drive on either side of where this man camp would be located. I want to move to the last couple things I want to do is to look at some of the work I've been doing in machine learning. Here's just one of the images I have from using a support vector machine for using drone imagery for image classification. Essentially, I've designed these ideas to create master address files for tribes to utilize and assert sovereignty over their lands, resources, housing, infrastructure, census, voting, etc. And that's essentially led to the COVID-19 Space Time Cube project, in which I've designed and created map series of hotspots and COVID-19 confirmed cases, deaths, research and development into tribal level GIS data integration, wastewater testing, contact tracing, time series forecasting, and state response mapping. And just finally, I would like to introduce my newest venture, which is a sister company Mato Ohitika Analytics will be the benefactor and partner with of the Mato Ohitika Foundation to provide scientific and educational services to underrepresented communities through data science related activities, and to provide all of these priorities through data ethics, data sovereignty, artificial AI and machine learning, geographic information systems, and STEM education. And that's all I have, and I will hand it over to Krystal. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. You're doing the transition. Great, Krystal. So we'd like to introduce Krystal Tsosie, who hopefully you heard her presentation yesterday as well. If not, please check out that video. Krystal.
Hi. That was my dog. My name is Krystal Tsosie, and I'm speaking to you from Hohokam, Awesome, and Maricopa Lands in Phoenix, Arizona. I myself am Dinesh from the Navajo Nation. In addition to being a geneticist and bioethicist at Vanderbilt, Tennessee, I'm also a co-founder of the Native BioData Consortium in South Dakota, which is an Indigenous-led research institution and biological data repository to help tribes keep control over the genomic and health data. I've also had the pleasure of being a tribal statistics instructor and also co-leading the genetics and preeclampsia study in the Turtle Mountain area of North Dakota, and I'm currently residing in Phoenix, Arizona, closer to my family. Since I only have a few minutes, let me generally summarize my thesis in one slide. So first of all, most consenting procedures in biomedical research are based on a risks to benefits calculation centered on the individual. The common rule which governs human subjects research in the US is based on principles of the Belmont Report, which when you consider it is now 4 to 5 decades old. So whether or not these principles are applied to genomics research, which is my area of study, it is a question. Furthermore, this centering on the individual is culturally inconsistent with Indigenous communitarian or group ethics. We have, since well before colonists arrived, self-governed as separate and autonomous indigenous nations for time immemorial. This right to self-govern has been upheld by treaty law starting in 1778 and also reaffirmed recently in the Supreme Court. Finally, DNA is the ultimate group identifier. Just ask the Golden State Killer, who was identified due to his relationship with a random third cousin. Now, I have a lot of first cousins, like 60 of them. In fact, I cannot tell you how many third cousins I have. I would be really annoyed if a third cousin I never met implicated me for something that I may or may, well, in this case, the Golden State Killer actually did it, but I digress. Informatically, though, when you consider the risk of re-identification, it's incredibly high for Native Americans, especially considering our large family size, small generation gaps, and kinship structures. So the risk of re-identification is incredibly high for Indigenous peoples, which we should consider when we're thinking about using forensic DNA to racially profile our peoples. All in all, ethically, the standard for individual informed consent is inadequate for Indigenous communities, especially related to genomics. And these concepts are something that I've already outlined in the published paper there below. So we talk about community-based participatory ethics, and you know, these CBPR principles have been related to genomics research in these guiding principles for how to ethically engage in genomics research with Indigenous communities. However, if we look at the breakdown according to the last census, over about 3/4 of Native Americans actually reside in urban areas due to colonial and assimilationist policies, which means that we really have to question centering all of these concepts and governance on purely the communities, when in reality, we have a lot of diversity projects and precision medicine initiatives that recruit urban individuals outside of tribal jurisdiction. And this is something that's ongoing currently with the All of Us study, which has been bioethically kind of problematic for U.S. tribes, in that the program has recruited well over 10,000 American Indians from urban cities such as Phoenix without necessarily getting permission from the respective tribal communities. If you consider that this project started in 2016 as a precision medicine initiative, they actually started recruiting well over 2 years ago, and only recently have started doing consultations with tribal nations, which really those practices have been not really transparent. So in the midst of backtracking and trying to do the due diligence of actual tribal consultation, they're still recruiting American Indians in urban areas. Which brings me to really our organization, which is the Native BioData Consortium. NBDC was founded as a means for tribes to actually conduct research studies that interest them. Who better than tribal community members themselves to actually come up with research questions that are of interest to them, especially when you consider that other things besides biological factors are probably more greatly contribute to health outcomes, such as socioeconomic status, cultural factors, and all these other factors besides just DNA and other omics. However, as an organization, we want to not only advance precision health and science, but also advance the discussions related to Indigenous data sovereignty, policy, and sustainability, and also do it in a way that actually engages the community. Finally, in spirit of this panel, I do want to state some work that our organization is doing, which is to try to increase the representation of American Indian students in the STEM fields, primarily in informatics, especially when you consider that less than 1% of students receive bachelor's and doctorate degrees in these fields. Our organization is proximally located to over 13 tribal colleges and universities, which is great when you consider that TCUs actually create learning environments that foster our cultures, languages, and traditions. And traditionally, TCU students have greater success rates in completing their proposed degree fields than when compared to those Indigenous students who go to mainstream universities. So this is our plan for our data science bootcamp, which is trying to not only didactically give training in classroom and informatics training, but also integrating conversations related to data ethics, Indigenous data sovereignty in areas related to health, not just in human genomics, but also non-human genomics. So thank you, Akee. I will turn it over to Randy.
Thank you, Krystal. That was outstanding. Looking forward to Randy now sharing the screen.
Aloha mai ka ko o Randy Akee ko uino no o ahu maiau no ka aina mokupuni o ahu no ho'i. Hello, everybody. I'm Randy Akee. I am Native Hawaiian. I'm from the island of Oahu. I currently live in Tongva land, the land that is the homeland of indigenous peoples, also known as the Tongva, what we currently know as Los Angeles. I'm a professor at UCLA, and I'm a professor in public policy. I'm an economist by training and American Indian Studies. So I do work in indigenous communities broadly. So today I'm just going to quickly go over some topics of Indigenous data sovereignty and specifically in the COVID-19 era and some places where there's a mismatch or where there has been some errors and some dire needs for improvement in Indigenous data sovereignty. So the first thing I'll start off with are the care principles that have been created by the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, as well as the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and I'll give you the coming up slide. But it's the care principles, and this is essentially 4 principles that data should be for collective benefit. The second is we should be able to identify who has the authority to control the data, indigenous people's data, and responsibility, that those working with data have a responsibility to share and support indigenous peoples throughout the process. And ethics, that ethics has to be at the forefront when conducting and using data through all life cycles of the the data collection, archiving, use. So yeah, I'll just make a plug for the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, US IDSN. You can look it up here. It's the website. It's you know, a loose group of researchers, community members. We've had foundations participate with a couple of meetings that we've had in the past, as well as tribal leaders. And we're connected to the GIDA, which is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which is a consortium of organizations, including US IDSN, but also the Aboriginal community group from Australia, as well as the Maori from New Zealand. So there are, for the time being, 3 of us. We're hoping to get, you know, First Nations from Canada, but also indigenous communities in Latin America, South America, Central America. But we're not there yet. It's all sort of a new everything's new. So just wanted to give a quick example of sort of where the rubber meets the road in terms of the impact of the lack of data sovereignty or breaches of data sovereignty. And, you know, just something that's come up over the summer, and it feels like it was a year ago or 2 years ago, is that during the CARES Act funding for tribal governments, the tribes themselves had to give to the US Treasury information on their tribal expenses, labor force numbers, even bank account numbers, which, you know, again, amongst governments, not a problem. The problem was that the data were downloaded by some government federal official and emailed to a wide array of non-federal government employees. And that, again, provided confidential information for these tribal governments that is now publicly available, relatively publicly available. A bunch of reporters got access to this data, and certainly a whole bunch of lawyers got access to this information. The problem there is that there's proprietary information there on tribal government operations and facilities. The data contains information that will provide insight to the size and extent of things such as tribal gaming operations, which again are proprietary. And it may impact their competitors in the future. And so this is one of those examples where the importance of data access and safeguarding, you know, really sort of comes to the forefront. So that's an important aspect. But again, it was a requirement by the federal government to provide this information so that they could have access to the CARES Act funding during the period of COVID-19. And, you know, we already have some research that COVID-19 has had a huge impact on American Indian economies, somewhere as large as 127 billion and over 1 million jobs lost in that first, you know, giant shutdown. And so this breach of data might actually sort of be more long-lasting potentially if it increases the opportunities for competitors to, you know, sort of take advantage of that information. And so here's some researchers for some resources for information on that. The Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, HPAIED, has some information on it. There's some articles at Indians.com, as well as NCAI released a statement on this release of sensitive tribal data, their opposition to it, obviously. Another area which I'll just touch on, and maybe we'll talk about in the discussion, is that, again, in terms of data integrity and data access and data availability in the time of COVID-19, data disaggregation by AIAN or Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander race categories are often difficult, especially in public health data, where many of these groups tend to be subsumed under the category other. And that creates difficulties in assessing, addressing, and creating interventions for outbreaks or, you know, sort of public health issues, COVID-19 being, you know, the most salient right now. On the other hand of that, and this is also where data sovereignty comes into play, is that there are issues of medical reporting and HIPAA when populations are so small that there are just a few individuals under these categories in some counties, in some regions of the country. Nevertheless, this is the gray area where I think our thoughts and our sort of development of strategies are quite important, because we do care about these community members and want to be able to identify them and identify the potentially emerging issues in those communities. However, we want to protect their confidentiality. And one example of this that is particularly interesting and troublesome happened in Iowa, where at one of the meat packing plants, there was actually an outbreak amongst Pacific Islanders, Marshallese, who migrated there for a bunch of historical reasons, but were not contained in the state level, county level data, because Marshallese are a very small component of the community. Nevertheless, identifying that is actually quite important in creating interventions and targeted messages in the COVID-19 era. And there are other examples of that in other parts of the country as well. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to Leah.
Wonderful, thank you all. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. So back to the first presentation from James. They say, thank you, James. Love your TCLP Fellows Program, ! Does the program include tuition or other financial support, or travel and registration support for meetings? With respect to the Indigenous Alliance Symposium, is this open to those not currently working with tribes but are interested in establishing those connections?
Great question. Thank you for that, Leah. Yes, the Tribal Climate Leaders Program is really the first ever type of program that University of Colorado Boulder has funded. And this is a partnership between the university and the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. So it was a match. And so that program was funded at $500,000. $500,000 for 5 students. That's a lot of money for 5 students. And I think there's a lot of discussion about how we advance higher ed graduate programs. And so that, I'm not sure how that's sustainable, but we're working on it. The other part of the question is, yes, the Geo-Indigenous Summit will be a symposium will be open. It'll be online, obviously virtual, and so we'll get it out. Leah, with all your 1 million followers on Twitter, make sure you follow Leah Shanley, and she'll get it to you. Thank you.
I'll tweet it out. But actually, James, that brings me to, you had talked about in our planning for this call, ways in which maybe the Academic Data Science Alliance and the data science community writ large might help to build connections and support tribal colleges. Asking for yourself and the others on the panel, how might we as a data science community actively and appropriately support tribal colleges for data science education?
Well, I'll just start. The National Science Foundation and the data science, good to see Krystal talk about a boot camp as well. I think we need all hands on board to look at different ideas of how we best meet the needs of tribal college students, in particular tribal students, where they're at. I think industry needs to play a role too. How do we create jobs where a student can live on a reservation, get educated on the reservation, have the infrastructure on the reservation so that they can take classes, they can connect, they can learn, but also they can begin to build mentorships and stuff with industry. What's the shelf life of data skills today? Do we know that? And how do we best connect with those tribal students? So tribal colleges are important. They're community anchors. They provide a strong cultural underpinning to the development of the human being as a Lakota person, for instance. But I really think that in this time now, I really think that we need new models of partnerships between industry, federal government, academics, and the tribal governments to really look at. Krystal, I love Krystal's slide about a national structure, framework, or strategy to address workforce development. So we still need good jobs in Indian country, and who's going to provide that? I think we as tribal people will take that responsibility as well. But I think that it's even better, I think, if we can develop these systems of support, these opportunities to really build a diverse workforce where they can be where they're at, they can live where they're at, they can support their families and communities, but also be employees of Google, for instance, or Ohitika, Mato Ohitika, the fancy companies like that. So I'll stop.
Krystal, would you like to follow?
Sure, thanks. I've been involved in a number of initiatives to try to bring these education opportunities related to data science to tribal students. And I just want to provide some perspectives. One, it's not enough to just take currently existing data science curriculum materials and just throw it in front of tribal students. It really needs to be culturally adaptive. It needs to be reflective of the different concerns, technologically, also just infrastructure-wise, for delivering those materials to tribal students. So one thing to realize is that educational research outcomes, which is something that a lot of grant-supported initiatives for increasing data science opportunities to tribal students, needs to go through tribal RRB and sometimes a college level approval. Just to gain, even if it's not technically, biomedical research, RRBs are more expansive in the types of research that it oversees, particularly with tribal students. And if that means going through multiple tribal RRBs for each TCU, then that's a challenge that one is going to have to be aware of. And, I always caution that inclusivity is one thing, but merely just trying to add another stratum of our racial ethnic population is not going to be far-reaching enough to be appropriate for tribal students. It really needs to be of concern of who's going to be the person to locally deliver it. Are you going to be relying on tribal college instructors? Tribal college instructors, will need a lot of help and assistance with implementing curricular materials locally, and they may not have the percent effort available for that. Tribal college instructors work 9 months faculty contracts and then may have to have a separate contract for the summer. Whether or not they have the bandwidth to teach and deliver those materials is another thing. So it's not to say that this is not like, these are hurdles, but it could be very beneficial if one actually truly has the goal of delivering materials to tribal college students directly and effectively and culturally. Other than that, I would really caution to just don't treat Native American students as just another checkbox on your diversity project.
Excellent comments. Joseph or Randall, would either of you like to jump in on this question?
Sure. I think one of the fundamental things that this panel kind of talked about before we were actually going to give our talk was to just understand what the urgent need for education and scholarship for tribal students, to build data science skills. And that discussion involved not only formal education, but informal. And I was just back on the Yankton Reservation a couple weeks ago, and I was talking to some of our elders there and figuring out what we do with our Sacred Water Bundle project. And one of the primary things that came up about this formal versus informal education is that there was feedback about understanding that there's got to be ways that we can give opportunities to American Indian students through an educational process that doesn't require, I think what this person told me is that there's got to be a way to do this without them having to take out a student loan. And so part of that intelligence gathering that I do every day on the ground level and the community level with the tribes that I work with and all the stuff that I do with Mato Ohitika analytics led me to think about how could I make that an actualization. And so that Mato Ohitika Foundation is a nonprofit that I just started this week after months of planning to, in fact, try and deliver some of these educational ideas and to bring in academic pedagogy in a way where, as a nonprofit organization, you can offer these services to students in the fields that they really either need help in or they're interested in, and to really do that in a way to help supplement and foster a new kind of way of thinking of giving informal education as a matter of giving back to your community, and then finally how that bridges with formal education. So that's essentially what I'm up to is putting together that foundation to provide some informal education, but formally as well.
That's fantastic. And so I want to encourage people to go to the Google Doc that's linked on the Attendify platform, because we've put in the contact information for all the panelists, as well as links to articles on Indigenous data sovereignty. And I tried to type in, Randall, the links to the organizations that you mentioned, but hopefully you can make sure I've got those links correctly. We have a question from Andrea Pitts, and this may be the last question depending on timing here. She says, many thanks to the panelists for sharing their work today. My question is, having settler colonial borders and the differing forms of data regulation within those jurisdictions, for example, differing regulations between Canada and the US and Mexico and the US, how has that impacted data sovereignty and data governance for Indigenous nations working across and beyond those settler borders? So maybe Randall, you want to take that question, because
I mean, I think the short answer is that we're all in the process of formulating that. I mean, I think everybody's trying to sort of do it in their own, figure things out at home first. But yes, of course, there are dozens of communities, nations that straddle borders, both north of the United States and south of the United States. And I think that's where we're headed, to start thinking about how we govern, manage cross nation state institutions, data collection, data advocacy and use. But currently, the way my, again, reading of the landscape is, we're all sort of just in the training wheels, portion of riding the bike, and trying to, again, come up with rules just domestically, meaning tribal nation wise, but also sort of for the nation state, and then thinking about the international sharing of data and linkages. Fantastic, but I think that's a little bit further down the road. I don't know any tangible examples of that, but maybe some other panelists do.
any other comments from the other panelists on that question?
Yeah, I'll just comment briefly. Part of some of the work that I do with my company is actually Dr. Shanley's work in the spatial data sovereignty. Her dissertation really talked about, there's lots of Supreme Court precedents about how data, there are certain precedences in federal Indian law that allow non-Indian people to access tribal data. And so knowing that if tribes enter into agreements with the government, they may be subject to FOIA. Part of the reason I started this company is because private companies have better standing, apparently, than some of our tribes do. And so my company has been designed to not only control, to be a controller of tribal data, and to not share that, and to have high ethics in how that works. And so this is really a pilot project that's ongoing. It's living and breathing every minute. And so I think aside from that, you also have to consider where do you choose to house that information? Do you choose to house that in a neutral country where it's not subject to U.S. subpoena laws, or do you highly encrypt it? A lot of those questions I'm still kind of putting back and forth, but essentially my company has been the intermediary for tribes to have data and to have me host the data for them and to help them protect that. And so that's an ongoing thing, but it's still being written as we speak.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time. I'm going to ask for last comments from each of the panelists, and then we'll leave the very last word to James, who's my co-chair in organizing this panel. So maybe Krystal, do you want to offer your last thoughts? Closing thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks everybody so much for listening. I guess really I just want to reiterate that the ethical principles related to data science should not always be viewed within a Western perspective. Indigenous data sovereignty is advancing the field. Indigenous peoples are advancing the fields of genomics and data science. So you really want to be able to respectfully listen to Indigenous groups, but also don't be extractive. Respect where those knowledge comes from, respect the individuals, and just when we're working with data, just know that you were not just working with impersonal rows and cells in a spreadsheet, that ultimately that gets tracked to a person and that person's community as well. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And Randall, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I'm just really encouraged by all the things that others are doing here, and happy to, on the panel, happy to have engaged all of you. And, I think there's a lot of space for all the work that we're doing. And I think, the more that we connect up and engage with one another, I think we're all mutually sort of supportive and complementary to each other in our various skills and ability to help train coming generations. So I was really inspired, really great stuff.
Yeah, and again, I want to remind the audience, please go to that Google Doc. There's contact information for all the panelists. I highly encourage you all, and I know Catherine Carson was already asking how can she connect with you all for collaboration. So Joseph, closing thoughts.
Well, I want to thank the Academic Data Science Alliance and Dr. Shanley and James for the invite to the panel. I just wanted to kind of close with the idea of all this data sovereignty stuff is very new, but I wrote my doctoral dissertation on how we could actually bridge culture and science together responsibly. And I really, it's a really challenging thing to do, and it can't be done alone. And so a lot of the principles of nation building and higher education and citizen science are all built into the ideas that I continue to put forward, and look forward to future collaboration with others that share the same type of educational views on where we should go with data science and to promote this field in a highly ethical and inclusive way. So thank you very much for the opportunity today.
Wonderful, fantastic. And with that, the last word, my co-chair, James Rattling.
Okay. Well, great. Well, I like that title, co-chair. I want to just in particular say thank you to Dr. Michaela Parker and the leadership executive director of the Academic Data Science Alliance, and real appreciative of the leadership. I think it takes a leadership to do what we're talking about. I think when the title was put together, it's very powerful to talk about self-determination, very powerful to talk about tribal sovereignty. Those are big words, those are strong words, and for many generations, our people, as Indigenous people, strived to strengthen. We know what happened to us, and so we're rebuilding now. And I personally see data as part of that rebuilding process. And also, I think that our youth is part of that. That's why I made my point today in talking about how can we support our Indigenous youth, both at the local level, regional, national, but also at the international level. So much promise and so much potential in our Indigenous youth. I've met them, I've talked with them, and I heard them. I saw and heard their dreams, and they talked about visions about a better world for their people. And yeah, they're individuals. They're struggling right now on reservations across this country today. But I think it's up to us as the ones here today. We've taken up leadership positions in our organizations. We come to these places like ADSA. We work with groups that are non-Indigenous. We share our knowledge. We're willing to do that in a respectful way. But also we know that we have a great responsibility as the adults, as those who are moving to another season in our life as Indigenous people. And so I call that emerging eldership. I'm just speaking for myself, probably the oldest one here, but that point is that, that we're still here. And I'm glad that ADSA has raised the visibility of Indigenous people within our organization, knowing that it's an invitation. And so when we have an invitation, we show up. And when we show up with something, we bring something, and hope to think that we brought something here with you today. And in turn, we can begin to develop what's called reciprocity, to come back and return. And I think that's how you build a reciprocal, relational, respectful, and responsible relationship. So I want to leave you with that. I want to say, Wopi Latanka Ichichapalo. Thank you all very much.
That was fantastic. I want to thank this very distinguished panel. It has been a sheer joy working with you to organize it. And I also want to thank Dr. Michaela Parker and her team, and the team that has been supporting the organization of this event. It's been beautifully organized, and I want to also thank all the panelists for their time and attention. Have a good week. Bye.